You are listening to Nerd Best Friends, a podcast of conversations you'd have with your friends, if you had friends, you nerd.
Hi everybody, welcome to Nerd Best Friends. This is the first episode 1, the pilot. My name's Analese and I'm here with my best friend Rob.
I'm Rob. My pronouns are he, him. I am a 40-something-year-old straight white guy, just like every podcaster you know.
My name's Analese, and I am a 40-something, she, her pronounced, cisgendered, Chicana female person. And we thought we'd start our podcast by letting you know who we are before we get into the nerdy things. So here we are, Rob, talking about nerd stuff. Your favorite nerd things?
Gosh, nerd stuff I like. I like a lot of nerd stuff. I like Star Wars. I like comic books. I like tabletop board games, especially if they have miniatures in them, because I like collecting and painting miniatures. I like playing Dungeons and Dragons. So many of the things. Did I say Star Wars already?
You said Star Wars already.
Outside of nerd stuff, I'm a school teacher, and my best friend is Analese.
And that's me. One of the reasons why we are best friends is a lot of the things you list off are things I also like, although I am not as nerdy as you are with the tabletop games and miniatures. I'm getting there. I can say Star Wars and the comic books, although I tended to go towards the horror genre of comic books growing up, but it took a while for me to get into the superhero things. You know, I remember watching Wonder Woman, when we were growing up in the 70s and 80s and things along those ends. But lots of books, lots of fantasy type science fiction-y things I am a nerd of. Although, thanks to my best friend Rob, I might start getting into painting miniatures soon with the purchase of a board game called The Dark Tower, and we can talk more about that a little bit later. I am also an educator. It's one of the many things I have in common with my best friend.
I think overall, there's a lot of pop culture stuff that you're a nerd about, from TVs and movies and books.
Yeah.
I would say, which I'm into too, but I would say like my main like real nerd out thing is the gaming. And
by gaming, you don't necessarily mean video gaming. You mean the tabletop D&D.
No, not at all video gaming. Sorry, nerds. There's not going to be a lot of talk about that unless we get guests on the show. Nope. Stuff that is on the table, physical, in my hands.
And agreed there, which is one of the things I thought about when we talked about starting this podcast is our age. We're a little bit older, I think, than the typical podcasters these days. And there's a lot of talk about what generations are which. We're technically, by the year that we're born, we're Generation X. And so
right at the end of it.
Exactly. We truly had a completely analog childhood and teenhood. And really, I think I was 21 when I had my first cell phone. I don't know about you.
Yeah, maybe 19 or 20.
Right. So we were well into adulthood when technology really became a thing. I remember being a teacher at my first job before I even knew what a text message was. So we purely had all the way through adolescence into adulthood, pretty much all analog, and then turned into digital. So neither of us are really big into the video games. I play some, but definitely not. And when we get to an episode about video games, we'll have some guests on to talk more about nerdy video games.
I think that's where a lot of the origins of my nerdiness comes from, is that time where it was analog and you needed to have hobbies and things to do. My dad was a kind of nerd, like a hobby nerd as well. He would build and fly remote control airplanes. We did remote control cars. He had the train models where he would build big tables and lay out all the track, and he would build like mountains and like the little trees with flock and the plaster and all that kind of stuff in the garage. And we spent a lot of time at the hobby store downtown. In fact, my first job that I got kind of under the table when I was 12 was at that hobbies store, where my dad was going to the hobby shop every Saturday morning anyway. So I would go with him first thing, or actually he would drop me off first thing, and I would do clean, like janitorial work, dust models, straighten models on the shelf, mop the floor, clean the big window, clean the toilet in the back, that kind of stuff. And then he would come to pick me up 4 hours later and end up, staying and talking with the guys and doing his shopping and stuff for another hour and a half, 2 hours after that. And I would go walking around or go get myself some lunch or anything or something like that. So there was a lot of background there as far as, that's where like the paints were and the super glue and like the models and things like that. But 2 doors down from the hobby shop was the comic book shop.
Yeah.
So very often I would take my $20 bill, because man, $5 an hour was great back when I was
1984.
12. Listen, comic books were 99 cents.
Yep.
1984.
I
Come
know,
on.
right? Bad math. Come on. 80s, the 80s.
So yeah, like I think comic books were still 99 cents, if not $1.50. So I could go down there, I could get the comic books that I wanted. And as I spent more time there every Saturday, I started getting more interested in some of the other things that were there. The game books. Oh my gosh, the beautiful art and things from all those TSR Dungeons and Dragons books looked so cool. And the miniatures that were there from the Warhammer and the Warhammer 40K looked so cool. And that kind of thing. Eventually, when I got to high school was when Magic the Gathering came out, and that was a huge thing.
Right.
But it was all stuff to collect and stuff to sort through or stuff to paint and build. So that's where it all got started for me. It was all tactile with the hands hobbies.
And it's really funny. I'm sure you've told me that was your first job, but I don't at this moment recollect that was a thing. I remember you talking about sweeping and working in your dad's shop, but I did not have that kind of hobby background in my childhood. Particularly, I mean, we grew up poor, so it's not like there was a lot of money for anybody to have a collectible kind of hobby. And as I grew older and I got into the comic books, it was the same. I had my first job was at McDonald's, and so I'd go cash my check at Santa Barbara Bacon Trust and then walk to Metro Comics from there. But I remember I read Stephen King when I was 12 years old. Probably a bit younger than most
early
parents. Yeah. And I didn't read any of the really heavy ones. It was 4 Past Midnight was the first book that I read. I loved the way he wrote, to where when I discovered the comic book shop, it was not so much the fantasy superheroes. It was horror stories. And to the extent I remember, they asked my age a few times when I was like 15, 16 on buying some of these. Like, I don't think you're old enough to buy these. And I'm like, seriously? I do remember Magic the Gathering. I remember hanging out with you and some of our band friends. That is another nerd thing we have in common. We were both in band in high school, and that's where we initially met. And we would hang out with band friends, and most of these band friends were guys. And I remember standing around and watching y'all play Magic the Gathering, and I just couldn't get into it at the time. I don't know if it was just a me thing, just not into the idea behind it. I don't know if it was because it was so fast paced. Y'all were so good at the game that I didn't teenage boys not having the patience, I don't know, to sit and to stop and say, okay, this is how you play. I remember thinking about buying the cards a bunch of times when I went to the comic book shop, and I just never did. Yeah. So I couldn't tell you, the nerdiness is pretty unique in my family. Although as we've gotten older, my siblings and my parents both ended up into sort of collector hobbies. But I do know there was the one game, and I mentioned it earlier, we're waiting for the arrival of the new Dark Tower game. And I think that was the biggest amount of time that I saw my family get into some sort of fantasy game. So the original Dark Tower game, if you've never played it, is this fantasy game where it's a circular board and a big tower in the middle. And it was pretty technologically advanced for its time in the 80s. But the main part was these 4 characters trying to collect these keys around these 4 worlds to approach the Dark Tower and fight the dragon. And it was really like a electronic Dungeons and Dragons type game that changed as you played it, because it did have this computer Dark Tower element. I'm really excited for the new one to come out. It's a great gift from my best friend that was a Kickstarter, and we're waiting for it to come in. And play some updated version of it. But that was probably the most nerdy thing. And then I think about how I think I've always been a bit of a feminist, unintentionally or unknowingly, because I gravitated towards stories like Wonder Woman. I then gravitated towards Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And that genre, again, horror, vampires, brought open a lot of that pop culture following that you mentioned that I really have when it comes to nerd things. So between the two of us kind of leads us to the next part of our episode today is why this podcast? What do we have to
Analese,
say?
why are you making me do a podcast?
Oh, yes, I am making you. I am forcing you. You are not enjoying yourself. For me personally, I've been toying around with the idea of doing a podcast for a few years now. And I know you had a pretty successful podcast earlier. That was NASCAR, also very nerdy. I think you and I have similar but different perspectives on nerdy things. And what I'm really looking forward to is potentially growing a listener base that interacts with us in between the podcasts and brings in ideas that we haven't thought of, nerdy things that we are missing in cultures. Because I do tend to gravitate towards the pop culture thing, like Star Wars. You and your son know so much more about all of these like extra outside of the movies. Watch this series, watch this, read this comic book, do this, that filter in between all of the main movie stories. I am hoping we have people listen and engage in conversations with us, both on the deep level and the surface level, about all these great things that exist now because of technology. But I ask you the same question, Rob. Why did you agree to do the podcast?
There has been this ongoing conversation that we've been having for probably a decade now of, well, when we retire and open our comic book store, we'll have it like this, and this. And as the times and things go by, I'm not a business owner. I'm not any kind of, marketing genius. That comic book store is probably not going to open. But what is the point of the comic book store? The point of the comic book store is to be surrounded by like-minded people who want to talk about the things that we want to talk about. The point of it is to see all the cool stuff and get hands on it, read all the, fun comic books and play all the, fun games. We keep talking about, someday when we open this, but the podcast hopefully is going to be sort of fill that gap. As far as building a listenership and having a responsive listenership, that is the goal, to have those conversations with people who like the same things that we do. I don't want to have adult conversations where I have to go with coworkers or my wife's friends and talk about, 401ks and politics and
adult
that
things.
Kind of stuff. I want to talk about, oh my gosh, did you see when Cad Bane showed up on The Bad Batch? Like, that's the stuff that I want to have conversations about. So where are we going to do that? Well, now we have an excuse to every week get together and talk about those things that we want to talk about, and hopefully get some of those questions and feedback, comments and things from listeners eventually. And
you're absolutely right. At the end of the day, it is an excuse to hang out with my best friend for a little bit each week and talk about things that we're talking about anyway. And we'll find over the time that you and I don't necessarily see eye to eye in a lot of things, and our two separate perspectives end up being really great and engaging conversations. And the desire to share that with others who might want to engage in the conversations is very intriguing. So let me I'm going to go backwards to go forwards a minute, and I want to clear the air. I am a newbie when it comes to D&D. And that is because of you. The pandemic actually kind of kick-started that, because we get to March 2020 and everything shuts down. And suddenly, what is there to do but maybe play some games online? And with you and your son figuring out how to do that, and you utilize all of the technology available to us. I've now played a few games. I have yet to play a game in person.
Is that true?
That is very true. All of my games have been over Roll20 and D&D Beyond, and that combination.
I did not realize that. So that's pretty funny, because I've been playing Dungeons and Dragons since I was in 7th grade, right? I was 12 years old when I started playing my first Dungeons and Dragons, on and off, depending on what friend group and stuff that I had. And then the pandemic showed up, and Annalise is like, hey, what are you doing? And I mean, I just started a million Dungeons and Dragons games because we couldn't leave our house. But man, if people weren't on Zoom all the time, so hey, dial it up and we'll play some games and roll some dice and have some fun. It's just quick and easy, right? Nobody has to drive. You don't have to coordinate rides or where my kid's going to be when I'm not home and those kinds of things. So it worked out really well. Now I'm in 5 Dungeons and Dragons games a week. It's like a job. But I will tell the listeners, for somebody who has been my best friend forever and never played a Dungeons and Dragons game, what do you do this week? Oh, I got a Dungeons and Dragons game. Do you want to come? No, Rob, I don't want to come. That's stupid. Annalise she makes every session. She's never late. She's in costume. She's got multiple sets of dice. She's, forget about it. She's in deep.
So, it brings back something I mentioned earlier. It's intimidating to be around people who know the ins and outs of how to play. I mean, D&D can be pretty complicated, right? If someone asks you, can you explain D&D to me in 3 sentences? You really can't.
You can go different ways because you can try to make it sound inviting, where it's like, oh, you sit around your friends and you talk in funny voices, and sometimes you roll the dice and do some simple math. It could be easy, but it's not really that easy.
It's not. That connects to I was too intimidated to ask for help to learn how to play Magic the Gathering. Better or worse, I didn't spend a lot of my hard-earned McDonald's money in high school on Magic the Gathering cards because I didn't get into it. But it was helpful to me with the pandemic because your son wanted to run a game and he wanted to run it by some people before he played it with his friends and made a fool of himself. So I thought it was really sweet that he asked, and that was the first D&D game I played. And so that was a really comfortable atmosphere to be able to ask all the questions and go really slow. And that was how I would think was helpful for him before he played the game with his friends, to be able to run through a game slow and see how people react to it. So that was really helpful. And now, I have 2 games that I think you DM both of them, and they are with people of different levels, and it's helpful to play with a few people on that. It's all via Zoom right now. It's helpful to play with some people who are really deep and your character can do this, check your sheet for this, do this. And then I think I'm kind of middle end on the other end on knowledge. And then there's 1 or 2 people in the group that they ask questions every single time they have a turn. And that's totally good. It's totally helpful. So I am actually looking forward to being able to play an actual in-person game with the knowledge I have. So, and I know we'll do an entire episode dedicated to D&D, if not a few, to talk about that. But accessibility is a big one. How do you access gaming like this with the sudden emergence of it with a show like Stranger Things? That certainly a few years ago started an uptick of people revisiting or learning what D&D was for the first time. Yeah, I don't know.
That's right. Your first game was the Stranger Things starter set we ran through.
Yes, the first game that wasn't the one that your son was practicing. You had gotten me that starter kit for my birthday a couple years ago, and we played that game. You DM'd that game. So that was the first full game that I played.
I think that idea of teaching the game and being an ambassador for games doesn't really occur to you when you're 14. Right. When I'm 14 and I'm learning Magic the Gathering, my priority isn't building other players or whatever. My priority is I bought these cards and I want to win with them. So whatever, I need to take my turn because I got to beat you, or I got to beat this guy, or I got to figure out how my deck works. It's not until you kind of get older and realize these 3 dudes that I'm in marching band with that I can count on playing a game with me every Friday are gone. Now I need to recruit players, or I need to go find people, or I recognize that you're a fan of this nerdy thing, but I want to do this other nerdy thing. So how can I be an ambassador to this game or this thing to bring you in and teach you? That has been to my detriment in the sense that, well, if I want to play this game, I have to buy it and learn it and make it cool. So I have too much stuff because I've never had, or rarely, I can't think of anyone off the top of my head who's been like, oh, I'm also a super big tabletop game nerd and I have all these games. Come to my house and play with my stuff. No, it's always me. It's always me getting people to do it.
That's also the joy of being adults now, right? We've known each other since we were 14, 15 years old, and we're adults and
in our early 40s.
I was gonna say we're in our third decade of knowing each other, but it's to be able to go and buy those games. Like, that's something that you've actually helped me learn to do as well. When I just took a trip to Portland with my partner, and when we were there, we went to Powell's Books. Powell's Books is a city long block store of books, and they do, if you need something really, really rare, very likely you can call them and they'll have it, because they intake used books as well as sell new books. But it's a city block long, so they have pretty much anything you can think of. An entire room dedicated to just graphic novels and anime, almost an entire room dedicated to just board games and games. And I actually bought a game for my partner and I to play that I wouldn't have. Okay, truth time, I was actually looking for a birthday present for you, but but I also found something that felt comfortable being able to buy and play. Other card games that I've sat at your table and played. Now that we are adults, to be able to go out and have that purchase power and have the time to, like, yeah, we got to learn this game, but once you do, it's pretty easy, and we move along with it. So being a nerd adult is actually pretty cool. And the technology advances we have now allow us to do more than we could have when we were 15 years old and in high school.
Absolutely. The technology. I would have suffered during this year of stay at home if it were not for the little bit of a technology nerd I also am to make sure that I have computers and multiple screens and webcams and microphones and stuff so that I could host these Dungeons and Dragons games. Because I'm very lucky to have a super cool, nerdy 12-year-old son that I can play games with. But
right.
If it had just been that, man, I think the two of us would have gotten really sick of him beating me every single time real quick.
He's a pretty intelligent 12-year-old nerd who probably beats you in other games as well. In everything. I don't know. I'm a reader. I read anyways. And so comic books, if we took technology out of the pandemic, the comic books and the collection that I have here could have kept me pretty occupied. But you're right. Like, to be able to just go online and play a game and figure out how to make Zoom work to your advantage, or how some of the companies like Roll20, my understanding, because I'm so new to D&D, my understanding is that Roll20 changed a lot during the pandemic to make the games more accessible.
I'm not sure. I hadn't used it before. I knew that it existed because a lot of podcasts or Twitch streams and stuff have been using it for years before the pandemic. But with the influx of subscriptions and money that they saw, I think they were able to really, turbo boost their development and some of their improvements.
Yeah, I do recall some of the players on one of the games you run that I'm in saying, "Oh yeah, Roll20 just added this, so do this to your character." Like, and then D&D Beyond just added this. So yeah, the use of technology during the pandemic also made a lot of that really accessible.
The role-playing games particularly provide a lot of that needed escapism over that year as well. Because in addition to Dungeons and Dragons, we also played Masks, which is a Powered by the Apocalypse game, which is very role-play heavy and not so mechanics heavy.
Masks was amazing.
That's a real fun one too. Yeah,
and I think Masks actually made me a better D&D player because I understood the role playing more. I think I might have rolled my dice maybe 20 times over the course of the weeks we played Mask. I thought that was a great game as well. But that becomes a very nerdy thing. How do you know about these games? Where do they go? And I can't wait to have deeper conversations with you about those things to guide what I'll call myself, like, middle of the spectrum nerd on a lot of these things. I think you hit the nail on the head. Very pop culture heavy on my end. I wouldn't ever have known what Masks was if you hadn't gotten that started.
So as far as part of the introductions that we're doing, we had posted the question to ourselves, what kind of nerd are you?
Yes.
That is a difficult question. we've kind of already talked about it a lot. Like, all right, well, I'm kind of a gaming nerd and you're kind of a pop culture nerd, but man, I'm a nerd about a lot of things.
This is true.
If
And
you
same.
ever hear like little bits of like noise in the background of my recording, it's my 3D printer, because I'm also a 3D printer nerd and like doing crafty hobbies and stuff on that, mostly to support my gaming. We mentioned a bunch of stuff at the top of the show. I didn't mention, I don't know, Star Trek. I didn't mention, there's just so many little things that you don't realize until you like nerd out about them.
Right.
Like,
yeah.
like Apple. Like, I'm an Apple nerd. Like, I know everything about my iPhone and my Apple TV and I totally nerd out of all that kind of stuff and organize it and make it all work and gotta have the newest latest thing.
But that, and also begs to talk about, like, my mind was blown just a few years ago because I had my phone, my iPhone in my hand, and I was at a vending machine and I paid for a soda with my iPhone, and it blew my mind.
With your face.
Right? I didn't need my ATM card or credit card or cash. I paid with something with my phone. It still kind of blows my mind, which is also a reason why I love our perspective and our age right now, because the fact that still blows my mind is kind of funny. Yeah, nerd spectrum is a really hard one because I won't know I'm doing something nerdy, and my partner will just say, "You're such a nerd," and I'd go, "Oh yeah, this is something I'm nerdy about." But what I think is cool about how society has kind of shifted since we were teenagers is that being a nerd is not just acceptable; it's almost expected. What are you nerdy about?
Right.
We're both nerdy about band. Besides being in marching band together when we were in high school, I became a band director for many, many years. You became a staff leader on some very big, prominent programs around where we grew up. And then we were on staff together when you worked for the band that I was teaching.
Mm-hmm.
So we definitely get nerdy about that. I mean, there's a whole set of arcs to talk about marching band and the evolution of it and what's happened to it, and better or worse. There's a lot to that and a lot of strands around that in terms of nerdiness. One of the original ideas we talked about was actually doing a podcast about Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And I know that can become a little bit of a interesting topic with what's happening socially with Joss Whedon and stuff. We can address that. And I imagine we are going to do an episode or two about Buffy, but I can talk about Buffy.
Should. Those are the conversations people want to have.
Yeah, definitely not for probably not for the pilot episode of this. Those are the conversations I want to have, but I could be a complete nerd about that and how it turned the later seasons turned into comic books. And there's a lot of psychology and philosophy that goes into understanding layers and context of that show. And the same can be said for Star Wars and Star Trek, although I don't know much about Star Trek. I'll be really honest with you. I didn't really get into that area of.
Well, wait till the Star Trek episode where myself and the listeners inform you on how important of a show it was in the 60s and all the barriers that it broke and changed television and pop culture forever.
Yes, I'm excited for that. There was another Stranger Things for sure. We could probably talk about Stranger Things for a whole episode as well.
That really got your Venn diagram of horror and that kind of gaming nerdiness.
It totally did. And it did a thing that is very unique in pop culture in that it was a perfect, you talk about Venn diagrams, it was a perfect meld of some nostalgia and the 80s. And they really nailed what the 80s was like as a child. Because we were children in the 80s. We were about that age, about those years.
I was also a Ghostbusters for Halloween.
Exactly. And going to see Back to the Future, that was what the latest episode, the latest season was out there. Walking out of the theater, seeing Back to the Future was one of the first movies I remember seeing in the theater as well. Actually, I remember being really mad about that. I don't know about you. I remember it was the first movie I had ever recalled seeing with To Be Continued. And I was a ticked off preteen. What do you mean To Be Continued?
I did not see Back to the Future in the theaters. I saw it on either beta or VHS. Beta. I saw it on somebody's VCR. And so the To Be Continued thing came. We're like, great, put in the next one. There was no next one.
Oh, gotcha. I thought you were about to say you saw it so late that the second was already out too.
No.
Yeah, I remember that. So Stranger Things was really great. I love talking about board games, and I am way more into board games and card games than I ever was before. I don't know if that comes with age. Sitting around and having some food and having some drinks with my friends and playing some games is just a fun thing to do. Would I have done it in college? I don't know.
Yeah, there's different things to do when you're in your 20s. There's those clubs and bars to go to, and there's those places you need to be where the right friends are that you want to be, and there's just different pressures and things.
Yeah, but I will say I wasn't really a bar or club person. Going to college in Los Angeles afforded me to be able to do a whole lot of other things. But I do see college students now, since I'm an educator of high school age. So I'll have former students who, you know, my rule is always a year after they graduate from high school, they can request me on social media. And so I am social media friends with former students who, you know, I see their timelines or things that pop up, and they're playing games in their 20s, hanging out with friends. And so like, it's as we've become adults, this whole idea of nerdiness and that spectrum of nerdiness has just evolved, and it's really, really nice to see.
It is nice. Embraced. It's a good thing to do. Like it's a wholesome thing. It exercises your brain. You have different kinds of conversations. You get, when you're with a group of people, you're problem solving and working together. Games are great for everyone. They're great for families. They're great for friends. They're great for old people. They're great for people who are learning. I'm definitely an advocate for the go play a game, and not just a video game. Although I'm sure someone else could make the argument about cooperative video games and things in the same way.
I mean, we used to play Halo a lot.
Oh my gosh,
about 15 years ago or so.
It was when the Xbox came out, and that game came out. It was like, it didn't matter. That game was the only game I remember coming out on the original Xbox, and just hours and hours of us.
Yes. Sitting around your living room. Yep. Definitely that. And as we talk about nerd spectrums, what I do like about another thing we have in common, and probably why one of the reasons that continues to fuel our friendship, is that neither of us are really stuck on one particular spectrum of nerd. You know, I can talk your ear off about Harry Potter. You could talk my ear off about Star Trek. I could talk your ear off about something Stephen King related. You could talk my ear off about this 3D printing game we have these little bits and pieces where neither of us are really sold on one area of a nerd spectrum. And I think as we talk and continue the podcast, we'll have more that pop up. Oh yeah, we should really talk about this.
I've got a list going.
I saw you writing as we were, for sure. But
it's funny because I'm into a lot of things, but you just mentioned a bunch of things that I don't know anything about. It's like I can't be into all the things, right? But man, it seems like I'm into too many things.
No, but I disagree. I don't know that there's too many things, because neither of us are fully into everything and can teach each other. And we do. Like, you've talked to me about Star Trek stuff before, and I've talked to you about Harry Potter stuff before. But I think that's what makes it a really great mesh between you and I in terms of this spectrum of nerdiness, where we're absolutely going to have some of these episodes where people come along and talk to us about stuff that neither of us are really good at. Or, you know, I know I could talk about the Marvel stuff, right? The MCU universe. As a high school band director for all the years that MCU was really, really hot and heavy, I just flat out didn't have time to go out and see those movies. And I remember seeing a couple out of order, and I can't remember if it was you or someone else, like, you can't do that. You have to watch them in order. How dare you? And I think the ones I saw were, I saw the first Avengers with Joss Whedon, because I was a Whedon fan from Buffy. So I watched that one. And then all that time later, I went to the theaters and saw, what's the one?
Guardians of the Galaxy.
And I think it was you who yelled at me after that. Thank you for remembering that. I didn't realize it was a whole spectrum. So eventually we started watching them we went chronological order, not release date order, right?
Correct.
And that's definitely an episode. We will talk about those things. But we watched a chronological order, starting with Captain Marvel at the time, and watched once a week over the course of a number of months, and caught me up. And I loved being able to have those post-watch discussions and become part of that universe. And now we are waiting for the opportunity to do the same with Harry Potter. So all of that rambling to really just go about and say that where we complement each other but also know the whole point of this is to have a conversation with people. I can't wait for those episodes that we bring other people on to talk about nerdy things that expand our knowledge and universe. Not necessarily, you're not going to go out and buy yourself a wand and claim which house you're from in Harry Potter. But
you never know. I would not have predicted that you were going to show up on Zoom wearing a costume of your Dungeons and Dragons character.
Yeah, that was a surprise for you. That was definitely a surprise for the reference there that Rob just made. In one of the games that he runs, I am a dragonborn monk. If I am saying that correctly, Dragonborn Monk.
You know, yes. You are. Are you kidding me? You're so deep.
I'm still pretty nervous about some of the D&D stuff, to be really honest with you. So some of our other friends in the game had been wearing costumes of their characters, and I thought, well, I'm going to get on this action. So I jumped onto Amazon and found a mask. Since it's on Zoom, I didn't have to wear a full dragon costume or anything. So I surprised the group by showing up with a dragon mask. And I remember your reaction. I was waiting for it all week to not spoil the surprise so I could see your reaction when I jumped on. But that same day, like 2 other people decided to be in costume for the first time as well. And so it was just like blown minds all over the place, that game. That was a fun game. That leads the second question we kind of asked ourselves and asked each other is, what kind of nerd are you? I don't know that we can answer that question, is kind of the conversation we've just had.
I'm the kind of nerd that I might have an undiagnosed OCD, because I am the kind of nerd that when I see something and get into it, I'm going to watch all the YouTube videos and I'm going to read all the stuff and I'm going to spend all my money on all this dumb stuff and get oh, there's this new thing that looks cool. Some people would try that at a very basic level. I see something that maybe is cool and I will go into it cranked up to 11, right? Like, oh, well, there's a base game. Well, I'll get the base game and all the expansions, and I'll 3D print the terrain boards for it, and I'll learn all the lore and maybe never play it or play it once.
Well, but I think at least, you are that kind of nerd. You're absolutely right. I'm not gonna go against what you just said, but I will say you have grown to be selective about those things you jump in with both feet. But I mean, that's another reason why you're my best friend, because I do the same thing, but I tend to fall, if we talk about what kind of nerd I am, I tend to fall on the literary side of it, meaning I will buy the set of books. I will not watch the films until I've read the book. I will do the things in order. When I go online to look up stuff, I'll go online and look up the order that you should watch the MCU, or the order, like I like reading the discussions, like big controversial. What order should you watch the Star Wars movies? What order should you do this, that, and the other? And actually, you helped with Star Wars as well. Before episode 9 came out, we did another little once a week thing where we were watching the episodes and we went chronological order with that as well, with all the Clone Wars cartoon series and stuff, the Rebels. What is the Rebels one?
Rebels, yes.
Rebels, they're phenomenal. I would have never watched them if we hadn't got into that nerd discussion of looking at the story chronological order. I will say, whether this is controversy or not, Rogue One is my favorite Star Wars movie. It really, really is. I mean, we can go rounds about this, and we will in future episodes, but that's
Rogue One is not my favorite Star Wars movie.
And that doesn't surprise me. But we can talk about how Rogue One's my favorite, but that's only in context of having seen episodes 4, 5, and 6, right? Would Rogue One have been my favorite if it was the first thing I saw? No way I would understand the impact of the end of that movie. Mandalorian is one of my favorites as well. Like, so we could probably have a whole episode just on the Mandalorian, and we likely will. But when we talk about what kind of nerd, I am definitely that pop culture literary person. I'm going to read the books. I'm going to go online and read discussion boards, get in conversations before I actually try something. So that's, I think, where you are at, where you are different, but it's also very helpful pulling each other into different worlds in that way of being nerd in that nerd spectrum.
Are you interested in the New Republic? Is kind of the new year? It's a different time period in Star Wars than any of the stories I think have been told before, but it's been the launch that they've done. Their next novel line and comic line is Star Wars: The New Republic.
This is probably the first time I've heard of that. So yeah, I'm interested. The same thing. The thing I never followed up on with episode 9 was the Soldiers of Ren, the
Knights of Ren.
The Knights of Ren. I know there was a whole thing about them that I didn't ever get a chance to get into as well.
And yeah,
I have
put
some
it on
to
the
catch
list
up on for sure.
My gosh, what a wasted opportunity that was.
Well, there's still time. There's always time for it. That's what I learned through our adventure through the MCU. There's always time, even if I'm behind, even if the podcasts I listen to or the stories I read are a few years old. That doesn't bother me, and I think that's also something that's nice that comes with age. It's hard to say I'm the pop culture one when I say I'm behind sometimes on some of these things, but thankfully with the way modern social media and internet usage is, there's never too late to be in the conversation.
That's absolutely right.
So we kind of went around it a little bit, but talk to me about some of that list you made. What are some topics of interest moving forward with some episodes?
The first thing on my list that I wrote down was Kickstarter and Kickstarter games, because Kickstarter has changed the board game and tabletop industry.
Agreed.
Immensely. The next thing I wrote on my list was deck builder games. They're one of my favorite genres of tabletop games. I think a lot of them are easy to get into. They're fun. There's a lot of replayability. That's something I would like to talk about. Masks. I wanted to add the Masks is an RPG that uses the Powered by the Apocalypse system, which has a whole catalog of different genres and things. I think it's one of the smaller ones. People coming to our podcast might be very familiar with Dungeons and Dragons, right? Because it's the most popular. It's the 600-pound gorilla or whatever. But to point out that smaller game and how much fun it is and how that works. Marching band is a nerdy thing I wrote down on my list because there's a lot of band nerds out there that I think would love to weigh in on how exciting that is and learn to the depths of which being a band nerd starting at, I don't know, 13, 14 years old, and like, I'm gonna go teach a band camp in 2 weeks.
You are.
Oh boy.
That whole band thing, we can talk about, like the evolution of what's happened to band shows is a really, really good topic. And on the more philosophical side, just the importance of continuing music education in schools. I mean, there's a whole list of reasons why. So certainly that will be an episode. And
then the topics of what order to watch movies in. Should you read the books first or watch the movies first? Those kinds of discussions I think will be fun to have. And there will be some forethought and some research that goes into those topics so that when you are listening and, this is the episode on masks, you're going to learn a little bit about masks. You're going to learn a little bit about Powered by the Apocalypse, and hopefully either have some questions and maybe want to try it, or be able to see what we know and then give us feedback on stuff that will be interested, because we're having these conversations.
And for me, I have a list as well. Certainly comic books is on this list. And I always want to push, when we do our research and we put our shows together, that we are including the people who might be a little too nervous to jump in with both feet, because the comic book world can be pretty intimidating as well. You can't just go to a comic book store and pick up a comic book and start reading it. You might be finding something right in the middle of a story arc. So one of the conversations I love having with people about comic books, and that we'll certainly want to talk about in an episode or two about comic books, is some suggestions. Like, you got me into Chew, the comic book series Chew, which it's finite. It's not one that goes on for years and years and years. It is one of my favorite things. And I've reread it a few times, and I've suggested it to a ton of people who then turn around and say, this is one of the best things I've ever read. So
great
to be able to talk about comic books in a way that makes it more accessible for people who maybe don't know what they're doing. And I talk about technology and comic books, technology and all of these things. I really love that you can check out comic books from your local library by using apps like Hoopla and what's the other one? We'll do the research.
There we go. There's Overdrive.
Overdrive. There we go.
Overdrive is the other one I use.
And you can check out comic books via that way rather than going to the store and investing a bunch of money without knowing what you're doing. That still supports your local comic book store, because like I have physical copies of ones that are really good. Certainly along those lines. Same with superheroes. The superhero thing is generally very nerdy, has become much more popular because of the Marvel universe, because the movies made everything so popular. It's something that like the very young versions of us wouldn't have ever imagined being so upfront in pop culture as we were growing up. So it made being a superhero nerd pretty popular and made a lot of things more accessible to a lot of people. But they can also be pretty intimidating because those movies all have some sort of Easter egg that if you don't know backgrounds of the superheroes, you're missing out of. I remember you saying one of the movies, and this might be a little spoiler if you've not watched any of the Marvel movies. I remember there's one of the movies where they mention a teenager from New York, and you immediately knew that was a reference to Spider-Man,
mm-hmm.
right? Not everybody's going to pick up on that stuff. So to be able to make that superhero idea more accessible so that those Easter eggs and those things are picked up upon would be really good. I mentioned earlier that I as I examine myself as I get older, I certainly think I've been a feminist for a long time. And I think you and I have had great discussions, and I'd love to dive deeper into these nerdy worlds, comic books, superheroes, movies, and feminism, and how it fits in. That does lead to the idea behind Buffy. And again, we'll talk about the controversy surrounding Joss Whedon and I guess we'll use the word movement. And there's certainly some problematic things there, but Buffy is so important because it's the first time you have a female heroine who wasn't just running around in spandex with some superpowers. She had depth. She had strength in ways that just wasn't displayed on anything ever before. So definitely in those realms of not only just talking about Buffy for people who don't know and might want to get into it, which sidebar, you were pretty late to getting into Buffy thanks to streaming media.
Right? I didn't get into that until Netflix streaming was a thing. So that was
relatively recent, maybe the last 10
years ago.
Yeah. And I watched it when it was live, when it was waiting each week for each episode. And I've now seen the entire series countless amount of times because sometimes I'll just have it playing in the background as I do other work. But certainly those things. We talk about D&D and board games, of course. I wrote down nerd history. So if I asked you, like, if we did an episode of nerd history, what would that mean to you?
I would definitely talk about the history of Dungeons and Dragons and Gary Gygax. I would definitely talk about the early comic book industry. The Comics Code Authority is a super interesting topic to get into if you're not familiar with that. What were you thinking?
I think we've covered a little bit of it, but of course that doesn't mean we can't cover more, but just this evolution of what being a nerd is. How you have people who are pockets, like you are a Harry Potter nerd and you are a Harry Potter nerd till you live or die. You are a such and such nerd, like just this evolution of and just sprouts of the trees of nerdism, I think are very, very interesting.
You know, I would probably also add to that list. I would talk about bullying, and I would talk about difficulties that there are when you're the nerd at school and unpopular and interested in things, interested in things like organizing and reading and collecting, and how that can be difficult.
Yeah. Or the nerd, even the nerd within your family, right? Like you have some families where you might have a singular person want to read all the time and the rest of the family wants to go outside and play a sport. And there's certainly a lot of that. Yeah. Almost to where what's happening now is making being a nerd be more socially acceptable.
Sports nerds are welcome here too. If you are a person right now who has never played football in high school or college, but yet you watch all the games and track all the stats and have your spreadsheet for your fantasy football league and are constantly refreshing the thing to see if you're going to beat your friend, that's a game. That's a tabletop game. You're nerding out about it.
Absolutely.
Here too.
And let's say you and I are both sports nerds. Let's be honest.
Yeah, a little bit.
You watch a ton of hockey and can reel off players' names and baseball, and I do like watching football, and I follow obviously my alma mater in college football, and I watch basketball, and like you and I are also sport nerds to an extent. I mean, you did nerdy things in your classroom with fantasy football, didn't you? You did a whole strand absolutely. In your classroom about.
Yes, when I was teaching sixth grade, our statistics unit was playing fantasy football in real time in the thing. Our lessons on narrative storytelling and 3-act structure and 5-act structure was watching Star Wars and critically analyzing it and stuff like that. So I was very lucky to be able to bring some of my interests into my profession at times.
Definitely. So there's nerds of all sorts. It doesn't matter what you're into, for sure. We're going to find ways to cover it, I think, in this podcast, in all of our different episodes and arcs, and definitely interested in what listeners would consider themselves nerdy about and would want us to talk about.
One of the coolest ideas Analese had putting this together, I think, was the question of what is the nerdiest thing you did this week, so that we could kind of check in with each other and the listeners, and they can be like, that's pretty nerdy. I think I have, like, I'm coming in hot. I have a doozy. So do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'll go first. I'm going to say the nerdiest thing I did this week was actually start this podcast, because I'm the driver here in asking you to start Nerd Best Friends with me. I did research. I did signing up for all the things, our Instagram, our Facebook page, our Nerd Best Friends email address. And then, looking at the timeline and doing some research. I looked up, we ended up not talking about it, but I looked up a movie that I thought was Dungeons and Dragons related, which is Cloak and Dagger, a movie from the 80s that I remembered. I don't know if you've ever seen this. In my head, it was Fred Savage. It actually wasn't even Fred Savage, because I did research on it. Henry Thomas plays this little kid who loves this Cloak and Dagger game, and the cartridge he ends up having has like Russian spy data, so they come after him, and he's got a make-believe character from the game that saves him. Like, it's a great 1980s movie that I remember from childhood. And that was kind of my impression what D&D type games were these like super nerdy, like I did all that kind of research, played with the microphone that I got and how to make things sound good. I think that was the nerdiest thing I did this week.
You know what might have been in your head? Remember at the beginning of The Princess Bride, Fred Savage is playing, I wish I could remember the name. He's playing a D&D like game.
Oh, yes,
he is. Text-based game where you answer like, yes, no, pick up the sword.
Right.
That might have been
Big.
stuck in your head, because
the movie Big starts with that too. Big is the one where he keeps trying to pass that like blah, 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 and the wizard this, and he types in an answer.
I bet that was the same game.
It might have been, but yeah, both of those movies start with the child playing a video game. Yeah, and that definitely.
Unless I'm confused, and I was thinking it was Princess Bride, and it's actually Big.
He is playing a video game when the grandpa walks in, Princess Bride. Unless we're both wrong, and we're gonna, we have a listener to listen to this episode. Go, you're both idiots. It's this, which is totally cool.
Oh my gosh, that would be
exactly
great.
What we want.
You don't have to call me an idiot, but if you want to write in and tell me the name of that game, and I'm sure it's like a super simple thing. If there's like a website that I can play that game on, I'll download.
I would totally play that game. Yes.
So yes, there we go. A call to action.
There you go. So that's the nerdiest thing I did this week. How about you?
Well, here we go. This is going to be a doozy.
Boy.
So I have been getting more and more interested in miniature skirmish games. For last Christmas, so December 2020, I got my son the Indomitus box, which is it was this huge box of miniatures for Warhammer 40K that came in to launch their 9th edition. But it's this huge box of plastic, and it's got 2 big armies that you can fight each other with and stuff. And I had played Warhammer. The last time I played Warhammer, I was in college, and it was 5th edition, and it was hard. There's a lot of rules to remember, and there's a lot of stacks, and it's hard. The rule book is 2 inches thick, and it's competitive. You're playing against the other player.
Right. Okay.
So there's not like a lot of cooperation and helping you learn the rules and those kind of things. So it's pretty big. And reading through or starting to read through this 2-inch rule book for 9th edition, it was kind of bringing back, man, these miniatures are cool. And man, I like rolling dice, but oh my gosh, this game is a beast. So I started looking at and looking for smaller rule sets and different games. I came upon this free rule set for skirmish games. It's called One Page Rules. They have a fantasy version and a sci-fi version. They have like army lists for all these kind of different genres of miniatures and stuff that you can buy and find or maybe have. And it's amazing. It's super easy. It's fast. You can get a really cool tabletop game going. I mean, set up to clean up probably 90 minutes max. It's really fun. I'm loving it a lot. I 3D printed all the little markers for the guys and these kinds of things. And I played a few games of the sci-fi. I think it's called Grim Dark Future is their fake Warhammer 40K thing. Actually, the last time I played on your kitchen counter while we were doing laundry at your house. So it's a super fun game, but there's also a fantasy version of the game. And I have a million Dungeons and Dragons miniatures. So again, I'm not even to the nerdy thing that I did this weekend. I got their army books and I started building little armies based on all the different miniatures I have. I can actually, I think there's like 24 army books. I can field an army for every single one of them with the ridiculous amount of miniatures I have.
Wow.
So Friday, my son was at a summer camp that he was there, and I was going to pick him up around 2:30. So before I picked him up, I put out the game mat and I got a bunch of terrain off the shelf and set it up. And I picked him and his buddy up, and I dropped his friend off, and we came home. And I was like, "Oh, you want to play?" He's like, "Oh, I have plans with my friends to play Minecraft online, something. Sorry, Dad." And he goes to the back room, turns on the computer. And I was like, all right, well, I can clean this up. But I wonder. So I got back on the One Page Rules website, and I found there was a document of how to play solo games and have like a step-by-step, like kind of artificial intelligence thing run the other side. And I set everything up and I got all my, and I played a game of fantasy skirmish tabletop by myself.
That is amazing.
All evening long, and took pictures and set up all the cool stuff. And that's the nerdiest thing I did this week was I played a game with myself.
I think you win the nerdy award this year, but that is amazing. And when you say skirmish games, you mean like a competitive, you're playing against each other, not cooperative.
Yes. And so skirmish it's small, right? So it's like small little guys that kind of run around independently, usually with like a full size like army game. You've got these like big units, like, okay, here's a squad of 10 dudes that I have to manage. Here's another squad of 10 dudes and stuff like that. Where with a skirmish game, it's like, oh, here's a leader, here's a couple of guys that have different specialities, and maybe like a big one, like a big miniature, and that's it. So it's quick and smaller.
That's pretty great, and that's pretty nerdy. Good on you. So let me ask you then, what's the nerdiest thing you're going to do next week? You gonna play more solo games?
No, I have. So I have a big project lined up that I am nerding out about. I got my Trello board for it set up for next week. It's going to have a lot of 3D printing and a lot of painting, but I'll talk more about it next week because that'll help me make sure that I get started this week so that I could talk about it at the end of the week.
And I think we should start sharing some of those phenomenal photos you have on our Nerd Best Friends Instagram page to plug that. I think I put one picture up there. It is when way back before the pandemic, after you bought me the Stranger Things set for my birthday, we were trying to see if you had enough 3D printed walls to configure one of the rooms for the D&D game. And so on your old table, I think that's the only picture that's up there so far. So yeah, I can't wait to hear about that project you're working on. Will likely maybe be the nerdiest thing you did next week.
All right. So the Nerd Best Friends Instagram, is it at Nerd Best Friends?
It's at Nerd Best Friends.
Okay, well, my personal Instagram is also all nerd stuff all the time. Like that's what that is there for. And I am ale gulper. Oh my gosh, I'm also a craft beer nerd. That's another
Gosh,
thing
we didn't even
could
talk about that.
Oof.
Oh, we got
You're
a
gonna
lot.
be here in an hour
Add that to the
tasting
list.
craft beer. All right, we got to wrap this up.
Yeah. So real quick, the nerdiest thing I'm going to do next week, I think, is I have the Wednesday D&D game that you run. That is likely going to be the nerdiest thing I do next week, but who knows? So with that, Rob, my best friend, this is the first episode, and we will continue on, make our presence known. We are on Instagram and Facebook at Nerd Best Friends. You can message us, nerdbestfriends@gmail.com, and we're going to keep going with this podcast.